Please be advised that this episode includes strong language quoted from third-party sources.
I'm in the mall the other day. I went by that store, Lululemon. I walk by and in the window of every Lululemon, there's a sign that says, "We don't support racism, sexism, discrimination, or hate." And I'm like, who gives a fuck? You're just selling yoga pants. I don't need your yoga pants politics. This is an excerpt from Chris Rock's stand-up comedy special for Netflix last year. "I'm all for social justice," added Rock, a black American. "I'm all for marginalized people getting their rights. The thing I have a problem with is the selective outrage." Selective outrage indeed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been slaughtered in the Yemeni civil war, and more than 10 million Yemeni children are starving right now. Yet there are no pro-Yemeni protesters purposely stopping traffic at busy junctions in Western capitals. "Everyone is silent about Yemen," said Yemeni activist Luai Ahmed. "Yet everyone is a human rights activist about Gaza." The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a federal government body, recommended that India be put on the list of countries of particular concern, a suggestion ignored by the U.S. State Department, alongside China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. But you don't see any demonstrations in the West demanding more theological liberties for Indians. In 2016, a terrorist attacked a crowd in Nice, France, and killed 84 people, prompting the hashtag #PrayForNice to trend on Twitter. Yet after twin bombings at a crowded market in Baghdad left almost 300 dead, there was no real international reaction, and not nearly enough tweets with the hashtag #PrayForBaghdad to make it trend. Organizations are also guilty of selective outrage. After another terror attack that year in Beirut, Facebook didn't allow people in Lebanon to check in as safe on its platform, like it did for those in France. And 8 years ago, then U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry gave words to what Israelis had been feeling for decades, as he criticized the United Nations for its obsession with Israel. True to form, the organization has issued 14 condemnations of the Jewish state this year, double the rest of the world combined. Then there's the media's addiction to overindulging in the Jewish state. For example, one article in 2014 from The New Yorker, as Israel and Hamas were ensnared in another skirmish, described the world's events by dedicating one sentence each to the horrors in Nigeria and Ukraine, 4 sentences to the crazed genocides of ISIS, and the rest of the article, 30 sentences total, to Israel and Gaza. Selective outrage, which can be described as one act of violence or upheaval in the world receiving disproportionate attention than similar concurrent acts, has become a matter of routine. And it originates, at least in part, from what writer David Graham called an empathy gap. "People tend to perk up when they see themselves in the victims," wrote Graham, which is another way of saying, people tend to ignore events that do not relate to their ill-informed identity politics. More on this soon. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt described it differently, but with a similar interpretation. Our higher nature allows us to be profoundly altruistic, but altruism is mostly aimed at members of our groups. According to Haidt, human nature is not just intrinsically moral, it's also intrinsically moralistic, critical, and judgmental. This enabled human beings, but no other animals, to produce large cooperative groups, tribes, and nations without the glue of kinship. At the same time, moral psychology virtually guarantees that our cooperative groups will always be cursed by moralistic strife, of which selective outrage is an outgrowth. It's easy to understand that an incident in your hometown is likely to hit you harder than one in a random city, even if it takes place in your country. There is also brand name recognition. The world is more likely to empathize with, say, Paris because of its international status, than they are with Baghdad because it is far less familiar to many people. But what about the world's selective outrage over the current Israel-Hamas war, and people's predominant concern for Hamas's quasi-military fortress, also known as the Gaza Strip? After all, Gaza doesn't pass the aforementioned familiarity test, and many people taking Hamas's side, both implicitly and explicitly, are neither from Gaza nor Palestinian. So why so much selective outrage? There are a few explanations, starting with identity politics, the tendency for people to form exclusive political alliances based on who they perceive themselves to be, a move away from traditional, broad-based party politics. More specifically, many people who identify with marginalized groups equate the historical and/or current hardships of their group with those of the Palestinians, irrespective of context and history. A textbook case of misguided conflation. All that matters to these people is that both groups, theirs and the Palestinians, are suffering, and therefore they must all be victims, oppressed by some so-called ruling elite, despite the more nuanced reality which suggests otherwise. Their overly simplified narrative is, a victim is a victim is a victim. Period. End of story. All these people want to know is where to send their exhaustive list of grievances and how to redeem their retribution. Let's use African Americans, for example, since the Black Lives Matter movement has been overwhelmingly supportive of the world's fifth most active terror group, Hamas. Not all but many African Americans decide to side with the Palestinians as if the Palestinian struggle is their struggle, as if the Palestinians were one-time slaves of the Jews who shipped them against their will across an ocean to provide Jewish capitalists with free labor. But Richie Torres, a U.S. congressman who knows better than to conflate two disparate peoples, reminded us why he is so aligned with the Jewish state. I feel no need to be balanced between Israel and Hamas. One is a democratic ally of the U.S., the other is a genocidal terrorist organization oppressing both Israelis and Palestinians. Better to be right than to be balanced. Another reason for so much selective outrage about Gaza is the classic saying, no Jews, no news. In the West, and certainly across other regions of the world, there is an inherent media bias not just against Israel, the Jewish state, but against the Jews. For example, America's most important newspaper, the New York Times, consistently placed major stories about the Nazi treatment of European Jews on back pages alongside the soap and shoe polish ads, according to journalism professor Laurel Leff, who wrote a book on the subject called Buried by the Times. Leff found that during the period September 1939 to May 1945, the New York Times published more than 23,000 front-page articles, half of which were about World War II, but very few stories about Jewish victims made the newspaper's front page. The story of the Holocaust, meaning articles that focused on the discrimination, deportation, and destruction of the Jews, made the Times front page just 26 times, and only in 6 of those stories were Jews identified on the front as the primary victims, she wrote. Leff also pointed out that the New York Times often used a more generic term, such as refugee or nationality, to refer to Nazi victims who were Jewish. More shocking even than the chronic burying of articles with the word Jew in them is how often that word was rubbed out of articles that specifically dealt with the Jewish condition, wrote Gal Beckerman, a news editor. It's almost surreal at times. How could you possibly tell the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising without mentioning Jews? But the Times did, describing how 500,000 persons were herded into less than 7% of Warsaw's buildings, and how 400,000 persons were deported to their deaths at Treblinka. As Leff put it, the New York Times ran front-page stories, described refugees seeking shelter, Frenchmen facing confiscation, or civilians dying in German camps, without making clear the refugees, Frenchmen, and civilians were mostly Jews. Various motivations, all of which are linked to the Times publisher at the time, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, who was Jewish, have been attributed to the outlet's decisions to bury and minimize the Holocaust, which the Times admitted to underplaying to in 1996. Some claim that Sulzberger feared the Times, if it gave more prominent coverage to the Holocaust, would be, in his words, viewed as a special pleader for the Jews at a time when anti-Semitism was relatively common in the United States. In today's day and age, and certainly against the backdrop of the Israel-Hamas war, the term Jew has been replaced with Israeli. But much of the media's anti-Jewish sentiments are largely the same. Uglier characteristics of Palestinian politics and society are mostly untouched by the international press because they would disrupt the Israel story, a story of Jewish moral failure. The news media's editorial approach predominantly is that the conflict is Israel's fault, and the Palestinians and the Arab world are blameless. Most news consumers of the Israel story don't understand how this narrative is manufactured, but Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations do, seizing it to legitimize a Palestinian cause that is largely constructed not by honoring Palestinian culture and history, but by delegitimizing Israel. To add insult to injury, social media amplifies these sentiments and creates echo chambers whereby users are fed increasingly more pro-Palestinian content at the expense of pro-Israel variations. Of course, social media rarely offers a glimpse of reality, such as the number of Israeli Arabs who said they feel part of Israel, which jumped from 48% to 70% after the October 7th attacks. Nevertheless, as media pundits sit in lavish studios far away from the Middle East, and as social media companies hire attention engineers to make their platforms more addictive, the empathy gap will only continue to grow. And make no trivial mistake, it has serious consequences. Since populism is an inevitable part of politics, and with game-changing countries like the United States set to hold presidential elections this year, one has to wonder how the anti-Israel media and social media biases will affect the outcomes of the Israel-Hamas war. This week, U.S. President Joe Biden was interrupted by ceasefire protest chants while speaking at a historic South Carolina church. Addressing the chants, Biden said he understood protesters' passion and that he has been quietly working with Israel to get out of Gaza. A bizarre choice of words for a president whose administration was initially so supportive of Israel's aim to eradicate Hamas from Gaza after the terror group's October 7th massacre in Israel. But Biden's diction pales in comparison to the fact that pro-Palestinian demonstrators are increasingly becoming more intrusive, obstructive, and dangerous, a sign that selective outrage is venturing beyond the realm of explainable psychology to behaviors that could soon damage integral institutions, social norms, and civil obedience. Many of these pro-Palestinian demonstrators will argue that there is too much happening in the world for everyone to react to everything. And for those in the crowd whose intellectual laziness leads to intellectual dishonesty, it is much easier to sort the world into a clash of oppressors versus oppressed, where innocent deaths on one side are more deserving of thoughts and prayers than innocent deaths on the other. There are also those who claim that everybody is entitled to their own opinion. Along these lines, my opinion, to borrow a line from Chris Rock's Netflix comedy special, is everybody's full of shit. Haider al-Assadi, an Iraqi and self-described ex-Muslim, was even more blunt. Don't tell me you give a damn about civilians. Otherwise, you all would have protested about every single soul being killed in all of our Arab countries. What you are doing is simply Jew-hating and Israel-hating, using innocent Palestinians as a card to demote Israel, to make Jews look evil, to push for boycotts against this beautiful country, to have the right to attack everything Jewish, from innocent students in universities, to Jewish-owned stores, to anybody who wears the Star of David or simply holds the Israeli flag. You are not protesters. You are hate-filled, uneducated, and uncivilized, and represent nobody except your hateful mind.